Hello, my name is Eleanor van Gerven and I am Director of Slim Educatief, a private teacher education institute in the Netherlands, and we are specialized in lifelong learning for educators in primary and secondary education in the domain of gifted education. Welcome to this session about raising the bar, the competencies of specialists in gifted education. The first part, the narrative literature review, focuses on the question which developments in the Netherlands and Flanders regarding teacher education influence the professional actions and approach of these specialists in gifted education. And the second question in this part is which development and shifts in educational theories in the Netherlands and Flanders influence the professional context of a specialist in gifted education. The second part, the systematic literature review, focuses on the question which knowledge and skills for specialists in gifted education are pointed out by the international professional community and by international research on gifted education as being essential for the optimal development of gifted students, and how can advice in an international research be translated into the Dutch and Flemish educational context. The third part of this study focuses on the question what knowledge and skills indicators pointed out by the international professional community and by international research on gifted education are considered by Dutch and Flemish stakeholders as the most relevant and important examples of competent professional behavior of specialists in gifted education. Firstly, I'd like to talk to you about positioning teacher education in the Netherlands and Flanders by using the model of intrapersonal adaptation. And secondly, I'd like to talk with you about positioning gifted education in general in a time where educational paradigm shifts take place. Okay, let's talk about educating teachers and educating specialists in the Netherlands and Flanders. And we're doing that by addressing the question which developments in the Netherlands and Flanders regarding teacher education influence the professional actions and approach of specialists in gifted education. And we start with the more general educational standards, teaching standards, and those standards are underpinned by several competences. Characteristics of competences is that they are contextual, interdependent, sustainable, learnable, action-oriented, and coherent. That means that a competency is never a thing on its own. It's never a knowledge or skill on its own. And there are always more competences, and as a group, they belong together and they interact and they interplay together. Competences are learnable, referring to the fact that you are able to develop those competences. They're action-oriented, as in you have to transfer knowledge to skills, and they are sustainable, meaning that competencies don't change overnight. In the Netherlands and Flanders, we use the Dublin descriptors to underpin teacher education. And there are 5 Dublin descriptors: a descriptor at the level of knowledge and understanding, a descriptor about applying knowledge and understanding, a descriptor referring to making judgments, a descriptor referring to communication skills, and a descriptor referring to learning skills. A basic teacher degree takes place at the bachelor level, level 6. Educational specialists are trained at master level, level 7. Dutch and Flemish teacher education are strongly focused on the development of a professional attitude, and that attitude can best be described by the model of intrapersonal adaptation. The model of intrapersonal adaptation is a model that is referring to the daily practice of a teacher, wherein teachers have to find appropriate actions and interventions for each learner. And in those actions, different persons are involved: the teacher, the student, and sometimes even parents. And all those people involved form an educational partnership. And together they determine what the need for change is, and what the aimed effect or the aimed goals are. And only if the aimed effects are clear, one can think about what is the most appropriate intervention. In order to go through this process, it is essential that the specialist in gifted education has the adequate knowledge and adequate skills to reflect on situation, effect, and intervention. A careful developed pedagogical judgment is required to set up meaningful interventions. Under the condition that all elements in this process are anchored in a professional attitude, we can talk about skillage. Knowledge and skills are learnable, but only by reflecting on knowledge and skills based on the context of the situation where you have to apply them, and assisted by a good developed educational judgment, skillage can develop. Skillage is not learnable, it is part of the professional attitude, and for each professional, that professional attitude, that skillage is different. Educational specialists function at Dublin Descriptor Level 7, and their professional attitude, as described in the model of intrapersonal adaptation, is very important for them. The basic teaching standards refer to 5 competency domains: a pedagogical domain, a didactical domain, a managerial domain, a domain referring to communication, and a domain referring to research and innovation. The position of the specialist in gifted education and the position of gifted education itself is affected by the first paradigm, the inclusive approach of education. And in the Netherlands and Flanders, that means that we're educating children together if possible, but segregated when necessary. In both countries, gifted education is supported by the government, and teachers nowadays experience that inclusion calls highly on their pedagogical virtuosity. Hence, they express their need for more on-the-job support. And the number of educational specialists providing this support increases. The second paradigm that affects the position of gifted education and the actions of the specialist in gifted education is our system of response to educational needs. Providing education from an inclusive approach requires that teachers are masters in differentiating, because that is the most important condition to meet a wide range of different educational needs in a group of students. In order to help teachers to differentiate in their groups, both countries have a layered support system, and this system is often represented in the shape of a pyramid existing of 3 to 5 levels. The bottom layer of the pyramid represents basic care for every student, and each higher level represents a more intensive form of support for the learner and the teacher. The more complex the teacher experiences the educational needs of the student, and the more intense his or her own questions are in how to approach the student, how to support the student, the more support can be offered from outside the classroom. In the Netherlands and Flanders, interventions regarding gifted learners are positioned from level 2. The third paradigm that affects the position of specialists in gifted education and gifted education are the current perspectives on giftedness. Tai and Chen distinguished 3 paradigms on giftedness, and each paradigm has different consequences for the educational practice. In the Netherlands and Flanders, schools find often an eclectic approach very attractive, combining perspectives from combining elements from different paradigms. However, that does not come without difficulties. Sometimes they try to combine perspectives on what the characteristics are of gifted learners from one paradigm and combine that with interventions suggested for gifted learners from another paradigm. And as a result, sometimes underlearners and twice exceptional learners stay out of scope. The fourth paradigm, affecting the position and actions of the specialists in gifted education, is the paradigm of social constructivism and 21st century skills. Empirical research provides strong recommendations for gifted education, and similarities to these so-called 21st century skills can be observed. In theory, education based on social constructivism should be a match for gifted learners. However, in practice, this does not always lead to the desired results. Students are often selected for gifted education, but do not always fit the profile that teachers expect them to have. And instead of adjusting the educational responses, students may be excluded from participation. So what lacks in the empirical studies is a concrete translation from recommended interventions into a clear instruction on how to provide these recommendations in a regular classroom context. The fifth and final paradigm affecting the actions of the specialist in gifted education and the position of gifted education is the importance of data-driven education. More and more teachers are required to underpin their actions. And often improvement in education is directly connected to test results. But in practice, personal experience still prevails for teacher above empirical evidence from research. Teachers need to discover how good for the most of their students is not always good for one specific student. And they need breathing space to find the balance between what research says and what their experience has taught them. Looking to gifted education through the lens of these five interacting paradigms, the specialist in gifted education understands theories of giftedness, is able to see educational needs, but more important, is also able to understand the educational needs that are observed. Specialists in gifted education are able to respond meaningfully to educational needs, and they assess the results of their interventions. The second part of my research focused on the construction of the actual matrix. And the sub-question I used for that was the question, which knowledge and skills for the specialists in gifted education are pointed out by the international professional community and by international research on gifted education as essential for the optimal development of gifted students. To construct the matrix, I used two sets of competencies. On the left-hand side, you'll find the competences based on the generic teaching standards: a pedagogical competence, a didactical competence, a managerial competence, communication competence, and competency in research and innovation. On the horizontal line, you find the five other competences: theories on giftedness, theory on educational needs, understanding educational needs, responding to educational needs, and the ability to assess the response to interventions. So each cell in this grid combines every time two elements of different sets of competencies. In column 1, we look at theory on giftedness, and they are combined with pedagogical, didactical, managerial, communication, and research and innovation competencies. The description of each competency is based on the 6 characteristics of competences. They are contextual, they are interdependent, they are sustainable, they are learnable, they're action-oriented, and they are coherent. In other words, every competency has a connection to one of the others, or has a connection with the other sets of competencies in the matrix. An example of a competency is competency 1.1. The specialist in gifted education understands and envisions how their perspective on giftedness influences their ability to see, understand, and respond to the pedagogical needs of gifted children. And for instance, Competency 3.3, that's a combination of understanding educational needs and managerial competences. The specialists understand how the individual students' needs are of consequence for their classroom management. But we can also look at competency 4.4. The specialist uses the input of the educational partners, designing and implementing meaningful responses to the educational needs for individual gifted students. The second question of this part of the research was aiming to bridge the gap between theory and practice. So how can advice in international research be translated into the Dutch and Flemish educational context? In order to bridge that gap, I distinct 300 indicators as examples of knowledge and skills, and they can be divided in 6 categories: stimulating academic achievement, the specialist ability for stimulating the effective use of different cognitive styles, stimulating interpersonal functioning, stimulating intrapersonal functioning, stimulating self-actualization with your learners, and general knowledge and skills, matching those of the Senkos. This is an example how a competency is translated into observable knowledge and skills. So we take on the competency as the specialist in gifted education understands and envisions how their perspectives on gifted education influences their ability to see, understand and respond to the pedagogical needs of gifted children. And the specialist, and you'll find here 6 knowledge indicators and 6 skills indicators. The final part of this research involved listening to stakeholders. What knowledge and skills indicators pointed out by the international professional community and by international researchers on gifted education that are considered by Dutch and Flemish stakeholders as the most relevant examples of competent professional behavior of specialists in gifted education. My call to stakeholders to please respond to my research was successful, and I ended up with 354 participants divided in educational professionals, specialists in gifted education, parents, and a small rest group. I can also divide the group between the Netherlands and Flanders. There were 299 Dutch respondents and 55 Flemish respondents. For the sake of this presentation, I only refer to the results of both countries combined. Now back to the list of knowledge and skills indicators connected to specific competences. The respondents were asked to select 3 knowledge indicators and 3 skills indicators out of the 6 presented in both lists that they considered to be the best match for the competency they were connected to. This resulted in a huge amount of data, so data reduction was necessary. And the data could be distinguished at 3 levels: a level 1 per individual competency, level 2 per domain, and level 3 at the level of the entire matrix. And after a first analysis of visible trends, I went way back to the basis, to the individual competences, and looked at the very detailed level. 1, which knowledge and skills indicators were selected, and B, whether or not there were differences between the different groups of respondents. Having done so, I did the same analysis at level 2 per competency domain, and finally I did a final analysis at level 3 at matrix level to see not only what indicators were selected, but also whether or not there were differences distinguishable among the respondents. In this presentation, we take on a helicopter view, and that means that we're trying to find opportunities to rank indicators. We are looking at lowest and highest selection rates, and we're looking at differences between different groups of stakeholders. Now, if you look at this graphic, you will see the scores for the separate categories of indicators. And what you can see is that all indicators except for indicator B have selection rates that differ significantly from the expected mean. Indicators in category E have the highest selection rate. Indicators in category F have a lower selection rate. And indicators in category C also have a relatively low selection rate. Now, what tells us that? Basically, it tells us that for stakeholders, it's really important that specialists in gifted education are capable to stimulate the students' ability for self-actualization. This is underpinned by as well more scientific literature as more practically oriented literature. We also see the same focus in more generic publications on education, and that implies that self-actualization is considered to be important for all learners. Indicators more aiming for more generic competencies and knowledge and skills matching those of the educational needs coordinator were less frequently selected, and that can be explained by the fact that both educational professionals as parents focused on more content-driven indicators, where specialists in gifted education may have made another selection. What was remarkable were the unexpected scores in category C. Both as well in scientific literature as in more practically oriented literature, social functioning of gifted learners is a hot issue. And in personal contact with Dutch and Flemish teachers, parents and specialists in gifted education, it is often referred to as the most important item in gifted education. For our 300 indicators, we could distinct highest and lowest selection rates. There were no indicators that were not being selected by any individual stakeholders. The average selection rate was 177, and there were only 18 indicators that had significantly lower selection rates. And there were also no indicators that were selected by all individual stakeholders. And there were only 22 indicators that had significantly higher selection rates. The lowest selection rates was for the indicator that states that the specialist in gifted education creates a joint perspective on giftedness between the educational partners. That one was selected by only 4 stakeholders. The highest selection rate, the specialist in gifted education knows different didactical strategies to challenge gifted students in their zone of proximal development, was selected by 306 stakeholders. Differences between the separate categories seem to be not significant. However, we were able to cluster categories of indicators showing that there was a significant difference. Indicators in category A, D, and E were more frequently selected than indicators in category B, C, and F. Indicator D shows significant differences between the different groups of stakeholders. What you can see here is that educational professionals and parents selected more often indicators aiming for intrapersonal understanding that specialists in gifted education did. For category F, we can see that specialists in gifted education select more frequently these indicators. Finally, we did some additional analysis, focusing on ownership, educational partnership, and peer group education. Looking at ownership, that has become a trend in general education, and as gifted learners are assumed to be autonomous learners, and ownership creates opportunities for autonomous learning. I thought that these items might be more frequently selected than other items. Educational partnership is also a trend in general education, and the concept of educational partnership and the importance of it is influenced by the support level in the pyramid of support for educational needs. The higher you climb in the pyramid of support for educational needs, the more frequently educational partnership has become important. Educational partnership is necessary for tuning into the gifted learner's needs. And the last additional analysis focused on peer group education. peer group education is considered to be crucial for gifted education, and it has become increasingly popular in the Netherlands and Flanders. And if we look at literature, we see that in literature it is stated that organizing peer group education requires specific skills. When we look at the selection rates for ownership, we see that the selection rates for ownership are significantly higher than the selection rates for the other indicators. And when we compare selection rates for ownership, what we see is that among the different groups of stakeholders, we see that parents selected significantly more indicators for ownership than specialists in gifted education. We also see a difference between parents and educational professionals. However, that difference is not significant. When we look again at the general graphic, we see that indicators for educational partnership were not significantly more selected than the other indicators. It is remarkable, however, that specialists in gifted education select significantly more indicators for educational partnership than parents and educational professionals. These selection rates for indicators aiming for peer group education were unexpectedly low. They were significantly less selected than other indicators. These low selection rates may be due to the fact that in the Netherlands and also in Flanders, peer group education becomes more and more part of regular education. And if you have to select, if you're forced to select for what you consider to be important, and you have to select items that are already incorporated in education or items that are not yet incorporated in gifted education, you may want to choose for those items that are not yet incorporated. Finally, we can draw some conclusions. The first part of the research, the narrative literature review, focused on two questions. Question one was, which developments in the Netherlands and Flanders regarding teacher education influence the professional actions and approach of the specialists in gifted education? Well, specialists in gifted education have a general teaching degree and a master's degree in their field of expertise. And the Dublin descriptors underpin general teacher education standards for both bachelor and master level. Specialists in gifted education have a similar role and similar responsibilities as other educational specialists. Hence, specialists in gifted education should be educated at master level. The second question was, which development and shifts in educational theories in the Netherlands and Flanders influence the professional context of a specialist in gifted education? Well, gifted education in our countries takes place within the context of 5 major paradigm shifts, and each paradigm affects gifted education. Gifted education affects education in general, and hence gifted education cannot be positioned as distinct from or different to general education. The second part of this research, the systematic literature review, focused on the construction of the competency matrix. And we started with a question, which knowledge and skills for specialists in gifted education are pointed out by the international professional community and by international research on gifted education as essential for the optimal development of gifted students. As gifted education is positioned in the context of general education, competencies should match both general education as gifted education. Specialists should be able to make use of the interplay of both types of competencies. Pedagogical, didactical, managerial, communication, and research and innovation are the 5 domains referring to general education. Theory on giftedness, theory on seeing educational needs of gifted learners, understanding educational needs of gifted learners, responding to the educational needs of gifted learners, and assessing the results of interventions for gifted learners are the second part of the matrix. Secondly, how can advice in international research be translated into the Dutch and Flemish educational context? And that question was answered by constructing the individual indicators. I provided examples of competent professional behavior for each competency. Indicators for competent behavior match 6 categories: stimulating academic development, stimulating the effective use of cognitive styles, stimulating interpersonal functioning, intrapersonal understanding, self-actualization, and the development of more generic advisory skills. And these indicators can be divided in knowledge and skills indicators. Teacher educators can use the competency matrix and a list with knowledge and skills indicators to develop a curriculum that responds to the personal concerns of educative professionals specializing in gifted education. Finally, part 3, the empirical study. Now, what knowledge and skills indicators are pointed out by the international professional community and by international research on gifted education that are considered by Dutch and Flemish stakeholders as the most relevant and important examples of competent professional behavior of the specialists in gifted education. Stimulating academic development, intrapersonal understanding, and self-actualization, the A, D, and E indicators, had the highest selection rates. Stimulating the effective use of different cognitive styles, interpersonal functioning, and more generic advisory skills, the B, C, and F indicators, are considered secondary towards A, D, and E indicators. Indicators aiming to stimulate ownership for gifted learners towards the educational process is considered to be important. At a general level, there is more common ground than that there are significant differences between the different groups of stakeholders. At a more detailed level, data suggests that the specialists in gifted education find themselves between parents and educational professionals. Differences between selection rates of Dutch and Flemish stakeholders are minimal and do not clearly indicate a different perspective. Now, no research comes without any limitations, so we should be careful in generalizing results, because the results of this research can only be generalized to those who consider themselves to be stakeholders of gifted education. And the results cannot be generalized to everybody considering themselves stakeholders of education in general. Socioeconomic and cultural differences between countries comes with a limitation for generalization of the results to other countries. And keep in mind, this research was not about what is objectively best for gifted education, but what is considered to be most relevant by stakeholders, and it is a different position. Stakeholders were asked to prioritize these specific examples of competent behavior. And if indicators had low selection rates, it cannot be said that these indicators were not considered to be relevant. The only appropriate conclusion can be that other indicators were considered to be better examples for the context they were presented in. In case you'd like to know more about this study, I refer to Raising the Bar, the competencies of specialists in gifted education. If you want to get in touch with me, feel free to send me an email at info@slimeducatief.nl or visit the website www.slimeducatief.nl. At the time the study was conducted, I was appointed as a researcher at University Hasselt School for Educational Studies in Belgium.